10:05, welcome back to the Chad Hasty Show on News Talk 95.1 FM and 790 AM. KFYO. Much to get into in this hour of the program. We started off by going to the phones, visiting with the editor of the Quorum Report, our good friend Scott Braddock. Scott, welcome back to the show. How are you today?
Morning, Chad. I'm doing great. How are you?
Doing great. It seems after a very busy week, you could say, in the Texas Senate, all is quiet right now on the Texas Senate front.
At the moment, although they don't actually come out onto the floor until mid-afternoon, so we'll keep an eye on that.
Yeah, so what's going to be, I would think that if business goes as normal this week, it's going to be a pretty quiet week for the Texas senators. Is that correct?
Yeah, we would think that. The Finance Committee is getting down to work, looking at the particulars of the budget and that kind of discussion. It's something you can tune in online if you're interested. Of course, your eyes might glaze over because they're going through every little detail of the $230 billion spending plan. But as far as any drama, not sure, but remember last Monday, we thought it would kind of be quiet, and that's not at all how it turned out. And you see my aversion to making those kinds of predictions.
Yes. Well, let me ask you this. It seemed, after you had all the articles with, Senator Kel Seliger versus Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick, Seliger kind of went radio quiet, didn't do any interviews that I saw, wasn't quoted by any other newspapers around the state. Do you think his plan was to go, not necessarily that he bit off more than he could chew, but that everyone recognized maybe the best thing to do was go as quiet as possible?
I think that if he's going to be successful as a senator, and he has been a senator for a long time now, he's one of the senior members of the Texas Senate, the people he needs to talk to are the other senators. I mean, you have Lieutenant Governor Patrick in what I would call, and what some others have called, a full-scale smear campaign against Seliger. And by the way, with that last interview that was in the Dallas Morning News with Lieutenant Governor Patrick, there were several accusations that were made against the senator, which we talked about, but with no evidence to back them up. And so, I don't know exactly what Seliger's doing, but if he's to have a successful session, his main audience right now is 30 other senators, and he'd be talking to them either on the phone or in his office or in their offices, trying to shore up his relationships and make sure that the people who have been his friends are still his friends, and the people who maybe are not exactly friendly, at least the relationships are still on the same sort of shape.
Yeah. Obviously, you've been covering the Texas politics for such a long time. You are there every day. During the heated sessions, you're there. You're at the Capitol. One of the, I guess, the accusations, if I remember right, from the lieutenant governor was that Senator Seliger had dropped the FBomb maybe at a female Texas state senator. That was the first I had heard of this, and we heard of a lot of brouhahas last session. Did you hear about this ever happening?
I did not. I can tell you that if a senator used that word, and by the way it was described by the lieutenant governor, it didn't even sound like maybe he directed it at that senator as much as maybe he just said it in their presence.
Yeah.
Did you read it that way? I would not be surprised if that had happened, but I wouldn't be surprised if that had happened, coming from the mouths of
anyone,
almost any senator. Right. I mean, the tensions get very high, especially toward the end of the legislative session. And by the way, it also seemed that that accusation and others were old. If he dropped the F-bomb after a vote, that would have happened 2 years ago,
right?
Because they haven't voted on anything yet. So it's interesting that these things are coming to the fore right now. And you add to that the fact that the lieutenant governor said that he and some other senators, I think, sat in a circle and held hands and prayed for Senator Seliger because of how all this has gone down. That read to a lot of people almost comically. I mean, obviously people pray for other people, but to go out of his way to make sure that gets in the newspaper seems sort of like a PR stunt.
Yeah, it was interesting, and it's going to be.
He begged the reporter to put that in the story. By the way, if you read the transcript, which is attached to the bottom of the morning news story, it wasn't something that got there by mistake.
Right. It's going to be an interesting relationship to follow, and an important relationship to follow during this session. Let's look at the Texas House. Since we've had you on, committee assignments have been rolled out. Any big surprises that, obviously this is Speaker Bonin's first committee assignment rollout. Anything that stands out for you? Any big surprises?
Well, I think the big things for West Texas, for sure, I'd like to focus on, since that's where we're talking. Dustin Burrows as the chairman of Ways and Means, that is a huge job. And as I told the morning crew on Friday, the old Spider-Man saying, with great power comes great responsibility. As the chair of Ways and Means, that is the committee that writes tax policy for the state of Texas. And that would be a huge job regardless, whichever session you were talking about, but especially in this session, whereas we have talked about here on the program, Chad, property taxes is going to be front and center. As we talk to the Republican leadership about what their priorities are, it's school finance and property taxes, followed closely by school finance and property taxes. And so, the way that gets approached by the new chairman is going to be absolutely critical. Then you look at some of the other assignments. For Price from Amarillo is going to be in charge of the Calendars Committee, which is kind of a mysterious thing to folks out there who maybe don't follow this as closely. But basically, Calendars Committee gets to decide once bills have made their way through the committee process, the Calendars Committee actually puts them on the calendar for the House floor. They decide when exactly they will be debated, and that turns into sometimes a bottleneck for certain legislation. Sometimes it's a speed lane for other legislation, but that's a hugely powerful position because it really is, the spot where those folks who are on that committee get to decide which policies the Texas House will actually take up and debate, and in what order. And so, when you look at the way West Texas fared, it did really well. And then overall, it looks like the Speaker, maybe even more so than Joe Strauss, committed to power sharing with the Democrats. When you look at some of the committee chairmanships that went to Democrats, I had some old Republicans say that they felt like Bonin was maybe even a little catered too much to the Democrats, maybe with some of the big committee chairmanships. His Speaker Pro Tem is a Democrat from El Paso named Joe Moody. The Public Health Committee is going to be chaired by Sinfronia Thompson, a senior Democrat from the Houston area, and some of those other committees as well, chaired by Democrats. Terry Canales, a Democrat from South Texas, is going to be chairing the Transportation Committee, responsible for billions and billions of dollars in infrastructure dollars. So the Democrats holding some very powerful positions, and in that regard, not much changed from the leadership of Joe Strauss, and in some ways maybe a little more committed to power sharing with the other party.
Yeah, I want to get your insight on this. Does this show the political capital that Speaker Bonin has right now? The fact that when the committee assignments rolled out, the number of Democrats that are in power, the fact that you have a Democrat Speaker Pro Tem, if Joe Strauss would have rolled that out, in getting into the weeds here just a little bit, there would have been some websites and some folks very upset, I think. And Twitter, the TextLedge Twitter hashtag would have blown up a little bit. You don't see that with Speaker Bonin. Is that because we're in this kumbaya stage, or he just has that much capital right now?
He has a lot of political capital, and I also think that when it comes to some of those websites and comes to some of those third-party groups that you referenced, I think that their main organizing principle had been, for the last decade, opposition to Joe Strauss. And I can't tell you how many times over the last few weeks I've seen Dennis Bonin do this or do that, whether it was the committee assignments or some of the hires that he's made in his office. By the way, he's got some old school Democrats working in his office for him. If Strauss had made some of the same moves, I could imagine those groups, those websites, as you say, just sort of exploding with protest. And in the meantime, if Bonin does it, it seems to be okay with them, although I would caution the Speaker and other Republicans right now just to know that those third-party groups, a lot of times, they will hold their fire at first when somebody is in office, and then turn on them later? I'll continue to monitor that. It's a great question.
Yeah. No, I think it's interesting to watch and see how this, again, how all of this plays out. I saw I think it was the Dallas Morning News. They had rolled out a winners and losers as far as the House committee assignments. To me, one of the big winners was just West Texas overall. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. West Texas, did very well. And you remember when the Speaker's candidacy first got going, and some were questioning whether or not it was wise to be, throwing in with him. Look, this is what happens. Those who are, early on the train, so to speak, they often reap the spoils, and that's what went down.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's see. Let's get real quick. I want to talk about this deal that was released on Friday, and the number of illegal. We got to work through this because it's
a little complicated.
Yeah, possible illegal voters that could have voted illegally, but we're not sure how many actually voted illegally, right?
Well, yeah, sort of. It's a report that was put out by the Secretary of State's office late on Friday. By the way, I found that timing interesting. 95,000 people over 22 years, by the way, in a state of about 30 million people. 95,000 are said to have maybe been placed on the voter rolls without being citizens. None of these are said to be illegal immigrants, by the way. These are folks who have who do have legal residence in the United States. And the Secretary of State's office said that about 58,000 of those had cast a ballot at some point. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they cast the ballot illegally. So let me give you an example. So let's say you're somebody who comes into the United States, you do it the right way, you've got a visa, and you apply for a driver's license, which in Texas you can get a 6-year driver license even if you're not a citizen, but you do have legal status. And then in the meantime, you may become naturalized. You may become a citizen, and then you can vote. And there's nothing illegal about that. Well, here's a number that's interesting. Over that same time period, about 1 million people would have been naturalized in Texas. About 1 million people would have become citizens. So it looks like what the Secretary of State's office is saying is that they're going to be doing a rolling purge every month. And this is new. They're going to be doing this every month where they roll out their list and say to the counties at the local level, you need to send notices out to people who may be on the voter rolls but may not be eligible to vote, and then it would be on the counties to follow up with those voters and make those voters prove that they are, in fact, eligible to vote, and make sure that nobody is voting illegally. Once again, you have the governor and others, the attorney general and some other folks saying, that voter fraud won't be tolerated in Texas. But this report from the Secretary of State's office doesn't seem to prove that anybody voted illegally or that there was any voter fraud. It just seems that they want to make sure that there's not any going on, if that makes sense.
Which is a good thing.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And by the way, one thing they could do is update the technology that we use to keep up with this stuff. I mean, one of the things that I saw from some Democrats over the weekend was they were saying, look, none of this would even be a question if we didn't have a voter registration system in Texas that was out of the Stone Age. A lot of states have upgraded the way that they do all this stuff so that these questions don't come up. And, again, no predictions for me. I don't do that. However, it's inconceivable to me now that Governor Abbott would not call voter fraud or ballot protection, something like that, make that one of his emergency items when next month rolls around and he gives his State of the State address.
Yeah, very interesting. Scott Braddock, Quorum Report, editor of Quorum Report. Tell folks about the website and how they can sign up.
Well, if they were not signed up for our free emails last week, they were missing out as all the drama was unfolding. You want to get signed up for the free emails at quorumreport.com, quorumreport.com. We keep you up to date on what's happening at your Texas Capitol, right there at quorumreport.com in real time.
All right. As always, Scott, appreciate your time. We'll visit with you later on.
Thanks, Chad.
That's Scott Braddock of Quorum Report. Follow him on Twitter at Scott Braddock.